Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. So Aristotle says that compulsion, being compelled by necessity or force, can make an action involuntary. So it's something that we're not responsible for. And what might be some examples of this sort of thing? Imagine that, I've used this example a couple other times. Imagine I put a chip in your head that made you do what it is that I want you to do. So you're totally under my control, and I've got some sort of controller, imagine something like double joystick, with a bunch of buttons, and I'm making you go around. So I say, well, I think I want to have him rob a bank. So I make you go into the bank and pull out a gun and I type in, put all the money in a bag. Are you responsible for those actions? We would say no, right? And Aristotle would say no, because you're doing the action, but you're not choosing the action. Somebody else is forcing you to do it. Another example would be, imagine that you're under the influence of some sort of drug or alcohol, so you're kind of loosey-goosey, and I pick up your hand and I whack somebody else across the face with it. I made your hand do that. You didn't choose to do it, right? Now somebody else comes along and say, yeah, that's your handprint on my face. And you can say, yeah, but I wasn't in charge. I wasn't in control of my own faculties. So-and-so made me do that. Evil Dr. Sadler, We can imagine all sorts of circumstances like that. Think of, for example, they've multiplied now that we have Facebook and other things. People get drunk, and what do other people do to them? What sort of things? That then they take photos of and put on Facebook. Draw on them, yeah. Pose them with things, right? Put them in situations where, very incongruous looking things. Then you snap a photo and you upload it, and you say, wow, look what a jackass this person is, Obviously, they put themselves in this strange, compromising situation. And then they can come along and they say, well, I didn't choose to do that. They made me do that, right? Now, these are easy cases, aren't they? These are cases where clearly you're not in control of what it is that you're doing. He talks about cases where you're carried somewhere by weather. You want to get somewhere on time, we might say, but a rainstorm comes down and you can't drive safely. You ever been in a rainstorm like that? First people to pull over are the motorcycles, and they get under bridges, and then pretty soon everybody turns on their hazards and they get off the road, and so you miss your appointment. You didn't miss it because you chose to miss your appointment. You had to stop. Something, in necessity carries you elsewhere. You get into a boat, and now, we have a lot more control because of the technology that we have. But in Aristotle's time, if you got into a boat, you were pretty much going where the wind and the waves were going to take you. You had a rudder, and you had oars and a sail, and you might get somewhere close to where you want to be, but sometimes you might end up somewhere totally different. Again, not your fault. That's compulsion. That's some other force or necessity that makes things go the way that they go. It gets more interesting when we're thinking about other people's wills and the choices They force on us. Then we get into situations where we would say, well, they made me do it. I didn't have a choice. I'm sorry, but things have to go this way because I'm listening to my superiors, or somebody's put me into a difficult situation. And then oftentimes people plead compulsion and they say, I can't possibly not do that, right? So that's one set of issues. Another thing that could come up might be our desires. Don't we sometimes feel like we're prey to our desires? We don't have control over them. They control us instead. Don't we feel that way at least with some desires? Think about when you're really, really tired. You haven't slept very well for a couple days, or you've been busy doing things. I mean, pretty soon it's going to be final exam week, and you guys are going to all be totally stressed out and tired because you're writing papers and catching up on things and studying for exams, and you're all going to look, pretty worn down. You'll be really happy when it's over. You fall asleep. You have the intention of staying awake, but you fall asleep because you're unable to resist your body's own urges. You felt that, like when your eyes are starting to close and you're like, stop, wake up, and you like slap yourself. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? That can get dangerous when you're on a drive. I can drive for about 13 hours straight, and then I start to get sleepy. And that 14th, 15th, 16th hour, because I used to make long distance drives, gets really dicey. And if I'm smart, what I do is I pull over, take a nap. Usually I wasn't that smart though. I luckily never got in an accident. So our desires could cause us to feel like we're being compelled. What else fits into that? Emotions. When you're in the grip of a very strong emotion, doesn't it sometimes feel like you don't have a choice? The emotions take those choices away from you. So let's see what Aristotle says about these sort of situations. He says there's some doubt about actions done through another emotion I put in. Fear. Fear of a worse alternative, or for some noble object. As, for example, if a tyrant having a man's parents and children in his power commands him to do something low, something base, something ignoble, when if he complies, their lives will be spared, but if he refuses, they'll be put to death. That's a tough situation, right? A lot of people would say you don't have a choice in that kind of situation. Aristotle would say, well, you're forced in a certain way, but you also still do have some sort of choice. You are choosing between different goods. If you think that saving your family is the most important thing, if that's the greatest value for you, you are choosing that value, right? And if you think that not doing something base is more important, or something that might be compromising, then you're choosing that. That's reflective of the kind of person that you are. He says it's open to question whether such actions are voluntary or involuntary. That's the question that we want to decide. He says, in a somewhat similar case, imagine you're in a storm, you're on a ship, and you've got a lot of cargo on that ship, and your life savings are invested in that cargo. That's going to either make your fortune, or you're going to lose everything and have to start from scratch. A storm comes along. If you don't throw that cargo overboard, the ship is going to capsize. What do? Do you throw it? If you throw it overboard, you'll survive, right? People will, in most cases, then jettison the cargo. The question isn't so much what are you going to do. The question is that voluntary, or are you being compelled? So he says, in cases like this, we want to call them mixed or composite. We want to say that compulsion is entering into that, but that kind of compulsion doesn't make us necessarily choose the good or the bad. We actually do contribute something to it. So he says they're much more like the voluntary class. At the time that they're done, they're chosen or willed. Isn't that why we hold people accountable when they do make those sort of decisions? we say, yeah, I understand that you were forced, but you still didn't have to kill that person over there to, keep yourself from being exposed if you're a public figure. We wouldn't say that, well, I was being blackmailed, so therefore I get a pass on that one. We would say, well, you should have done something different. He says, the end or motive in an act varies with the occasion, so the terms voluntary and involuntary should be used with reference to the time of the action. So if we want to think about compulsion, we have to think about those sorts of things. And he does give you some ways out. He says, in some cases, submission, though not praise, is condoned when a man does something wrong through fear of penalties that impose too great a strain on human nature and that no one could endure. And by no one, he doesn't mean nobody ever, anytime throughout history, because guaranteed, if you look, you'll find anything that you could possibly pick, there's somebody who put up with it and actually chose it, because, there have been billions of human beings on this planet. What he means is there are certain thresholds beyond which we would say, okay, at that point, you're no longer able to keep yourself back. So where do these thresholds lie? He doesn't actually tell you that. It would be nice if he did, wouldn't it? And you know exactly how far you could go. That's something that we have to try to figure out. We're not going to try to do that in this class itself. But what could you use, do you think, as reliable guides for that? Maybe look at people that you admire, see how much they're able to endure, and then if it goes beyond that, then you can say, yes, I was compelled. He says, there seem to be some acts which a person cannot be compelled to do, and rather than do them, you ought to submit to the most terrible death. And he has an example of matricide, which means killing your mother. For the Greeks, killing a family member was considered to be much worse than killing somebody else, and killing a parent was considered to be much worse than killing like a brother or sister. And killing your mother is considered to be in some ways worse than killing your father. So Aristotle says, there's this guy in a play who's compelled by certain threats to murder his mother, and he says, really, he can't say that he's getting off of that because he's being threatened. That's really his choice. And he says, but it is difficult to decide how far we ought to go in choosing to do a given act rather than suffer a given penalty, or in ignoring a given penalty rather than commit a given action. So this is not something that we have hard and fast rules for. This is something that we have to sort of think about and figure out. He also brings up another difficulty, which ties in with the problem of what we call self-control or lack of self-control. He says, once we've actually made our decision, imagine you're in a difficult choice, and you've been, you didn't choose the situation that you're in, and both alternatives seem kind of bad to you, and you're like choosing the lesser of the two evils. It's hard to actually stick with that choice, isn't it? Because you don't like either one of the alternatives. And he says, when made in most of these dilemmas, the penalty threatened is painful and the deed forced upon is dishonorable. And so that makes it quite difficult. We need self-control for that. What about some other cases that we could think of? If somebody were in fact a hardcore drug user, and they tell you that let's say they do a crime in order to be able to procure drugs. They're going to steal something so they can fence it, so they can get some money, so they can go get it fixed. Would you say, first of all, would you say, put Aristotle aside, would you say that that person is compelled, that it's not their choice? No? They always have a choice? Drug addiction can get pretty serious. It can deprive a person of not only vital elements of their personality, but we might even say their freedom of will. What would Aristotle say, do you think? How would he see that? I think, he would be willing to say that in those cases, that's one of those instances where it's going beyond what a person could endure. You listen to the accounts of what it's like to try to kick heroin or kick meth, and it's very tough. And people generally fail at it unless they've got some sort of help. Even quitting smoking or quitting drinking alcohol is pretty tough if you become addicted to it. I know I've quit smoking many times, which means that I didn't stay quit most of the times that I quit. Right? I failed. A lot of times that was through failure of will on my part. But if I was really, really addicted, then I wouldn't really have a choice, would I? Now, you can say, well, you made a choice to get addicted. But that's more about the past, once you're actually in the grip of compulsion. What do you guys think about these desires, fears, emotions? Is it possible to get so angry that you can't be held accountable for what you do? What do you think? Yeah.
What if you have like some sort of a medical issue that makes an involuntary, like the assignment that's due today, for example, anger management? It's something that you just had for a while.
Yeah.
Or maybe Tourette's, where you act a certain way to certain things.
Tourette's is a great example because there's actually like a South Park episode. Have you guys seen this? The South Park episode about Tourette's, where Cartman pretends he's got Tourette's because he gets to swear all the time, because people who have Tourette's are excused because of their swearing, because it's a neurological condition. It's your body sort of going against you. They're not actually choosing to say the stuff. And then, of course, the joke on Cartman is that he ends up with Tourette's, and he finds himself unable to stop swearing when he wants to. He finds himself, in that case, what Cartman would be doing, he's actually acquiring a vice, from Aristotle's perspective, that looks like Tourette's. And before people understood it as a medical condition, people were holding people with Tourette's accountable for it and saying, you're choosing to swear at me. Now we know better. We know that, look, they can try to resist, but they're going to fail. Whatever they're going to, and hopefully they can keep themselves saying things that are fairly mild and not crazy, terrible swears. And there could be other medical conditions, what we call diagnosable disorders, using the DSM-4. DSM-5 is out, but there's a lot of controversy about it, so I wouldn't use it. But the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that people in psychotherapy use, there are certain things that are diagnosable as severe disorders, and people in the grip of those, we would say that they are suffering from a compulsion which they cannot resist effectively. They may be able to resist it through great force of will in some circumstances, but sooner or later they're going to fail. So anger could be, incapacity to control one's anger could fit into that. And could you be placed, are there some situations where you could take a normal person off the street who doesn't have anger problems and just subject them to so much abuse that sooner or later you're going to get the anger response from them? I think so. Aristotle would be sympathetic to that sort of thing. Could there be some circumstances that are not actually caused by somebody being mean and putting that person into that situation, but just all sorts of frustrations that arise, and a person then loses control? Imagine, they lose their house, they lose their job, they get splashed by the car going by the puddle, totally soaked. What else should we add to it? Their shoes fall apart, they're sick. You can just keep adding more and more things, right? Would a person who's in that sort of situation, if they lose their temper, was that voluntary or involuntary on their part? I think at a certain point we would be willing to say, and Aristotle would be willing to say, that was involuntary. They were pushed so far that they couldn't do otherwise. Or we could say this about other emotions, like being sad, depression, right? Some people are unable to cope, get out of bed sometimes even, and people will come by and say, come on, rise and shine, put a happy face on, get out of bed. And then they'll say, well, you're malingering. You're not actually that sad, you're making yourself sad or something like that. Aristotle would be willing to say there's some cases where somebody could be, their reactions are coming from emotions, and there's no way that they can do it. I think he'd set the bar kind of high for that. And if it's a consequence of our own vices, of our own bad choices, made over and over again, if every time that I get sad I go and I lay in bed and I don't talk with anybody, pretty soon I'm going to get depressed, right? And maybe my depression in that case is not the same thing as somebody who's got a chemical imbalance and actually needs antidepressants. Maybe I am in that case malingering. And then I would be responsible for it. It wouldn't be a compulsion, it would be a vice. Do you guys see the difference between those categories? There's one other case of compulsion that Aristotle talks about, not in Book 3, but in Book 7. And that is what he calls brutality. And he gives examples of people who have been abused, or things have gone. We had some examples of like neurological disorders. If you grow up in a society that is really off kilter as far as its culture. Imagine, for example, growing up in a combat zone. People have all sorts of problems that come about because of that. They're not all well adjusted. There would be some things that perhaps we would be willing to excuse for them and say that they're unable to keep themselves from doing. If they had an incredible sense of paranoia, if you grew up in a combat zone, maybe that's actually an adaptive response, right? We would say that somebody like that is not as responsible for their actions. We would want to try to fix them if we could, though, right? We would want to try to make things better for them, but we may not be able to do that. And in some cases of horrific abuse, in some cases of Aristotle called morbid disorders, that may not be possible. At that point, the person is for Aristotle, below the level of the human, though. So they're no longer a human agent. They're more just like an animal. They're more just following instincts, urges, those sorts of things. And he says that this is morally less bad than vice, but it's more horrific. Because when you look at situations like that, the normal human response to that is to feel a sense of something has gone terribly wrong. Those are pretty rare, I think, that we encounter that with compulsion, right? Sometimes people actually will try to pretend like that's the case so that they can excuse their conduct. But in our society, things like that are relatively rare, aren't they? They're not rare everywhere, though. And they haven't been rare at every point in history. So, yeah, that's probably enough about compulsion.